Okay, thank you all for coming. I think this is the biggest Hacker Dojo meetup we've ever had, so it's great to see the progress. And thanks to Martin for helping do my job in introducing a few turkeys. So that's hopefully going to make life a bit easier around 20 to 25 minutes from now. So I guess I'll just get right into it. So topic for today is governance for public blockchains and DAOs. And the reason why this topic is interesting, as you might tell from the subtitle, is that governance is something that people have thought about for a very long time and that people have thought about in very different fields. So people have thought about the concept of governance of countries, governance of corporations, political parties, religions. What happens if there's some issue in the religion that people disagree on? Well, guess what? There's a fork. Unfortunately not on GitHub because GitHub didn't exist at the time. Open source projects. So how exactly does governance of open source projects work? Who makes the decisions? What are the incentives? What kinds of options are available to each individual participant? If you don't like what Linus Torvalds is doing, then you can fork, but what exactly does forking entail? Now, blockchains are interesting because I've actually come to realize that the situation and the specific governance challenges that public blockchains have really are quite unique. They're not really like any of these. They're somewhat like all of these, but they're not quite like any of them. And I'll start getting into the reasons why. So, in general, what we're talking about is what is the right model to use to look at public blockchain projects. So people interested in governance may have heard this dichotomy between voice and exit. So do you sort of make your opinion known by some kind of voting process or by complaining on Reddit or going to a town hall meeting, or do you decide to just pack up your bags and go somewhere else? There are differences between what I call standalone projects and what I call dependent projects. So this is the difference between something which is a blockchain by itself and something which is built on top of another system, so DAOs on Ethereum. In general, a notion of going from just talking about crypto economics to something that's a bit broader, a sort of notion of kind of almost crypto political science that talks about exactly what the governance challenges are, what kinds a sort of multidisciplinary view of sort of what games people are playing, using the term game in a game theoretic sense. This sort of Thomas Schelling's model from A Theory of Conflict, talking about brinksmanship as a model of probabilistic punishment, and in general his sort of views on the economics of mutually assured destruction in the Cold War has more parallels than you might think, interestingly enough. So, the old model. So this is the old model of governance of public blockchains. Basically, there is a protocol. That protocol is static. It is guaranteed that honest users will follow this protocol forever. The only thing that you have to worry about is essentially 51% attacks. Yay, the protocol is static. There are no governance challenges whatsoever. There's no committees deciding anything. It's all algorithmic, non-political money. Yay, banish the Federal Reserve forever. We win, utopia. This is the old model. So I'll have to warn people that there are parts of this presentation that are going to be a bit controversial, and part of the reason why is because I take opinions that real people have posted on Reddit, and I'm going to state that I think these opinions are wrong and to some degree absolutely crazy. So here's a quote from a thread that appeared about a month ago. And the first few words from it really struck out at me. The first few words are, it's a system that has been designed to resist change. So if you just think about these words, what do you think the person is talking about? Option A, the traditional banking system. Raise your hands if you think he's talking about that. Option B, regulators. Or option C, the shiny newfangled thing that's supposed to be nimbler and faster than the above. So now, if you actually go into this post about I think the intention was to try to say that it's designed to resist change in the sense of its designs to resist, things like that thing that Peter Todd leaked a few days ago about trying to force miners to, implement KYC features into the Bitcoin protocol, or various different kinds of censorship attacks. But at the same time, doing that by having a static protocol, I think over the last couple of years it's become clear that that's just not a viable approach. So ultimately, software has to evolve. Software that's finished is software that's dead. And if software is going to evolve, and if protocols are going to evolve, then there has to be some mechanism for agreeing on how software is going to upgrade. So a taxonomy of forks. So in general, Bitcoin is the one kind of practical example of this that we've seen. We've also, fortunately, had Ethereum running for about 9 months, and we've run through one hard fork. And a lot of other blockchain protocols have had forks as well, although they most of them are relatively smaller and kind of not as high profile and well known as Bitcoin and Ethereum have been especially recently. But in general, there's a few different ways that you can change the protocol. And the interesting thing is that exactly how viable each of them are does depend heavily on exactly what model you're using, kind of what does the protocol look like. It depends heavily on what transactions look like, how exactly is the state stored, and a bunch of fairly technical details. But in general, there's 3 categories, and a lot of people think only about 2 categories, but I actually deliberately sort of expanded the hard fork category into 2. One of them is a soft fork. So valid messages under the new rules are a strict subset of valid messages under the old rules. So there's a bunch of stuff that was valid, but you're shrinking it. Now, interestingly enough, it turns out that just shrinking the set of things that's valid actually can make a protocol more powerful. It can actually add new features. And a simple sort of very intuitive reason why that's the case is, take a piece of paper. It's just a rectangle, fairly low entropy, extremely simple. Now imagine you rip a part of that piece of paper out. And let's say the part of the piece of paper you ripped out is, shaped like a snowflake. You have strictly reduced the size of the piece of paper. And yet, what's left is a much more complex and intricate pattern than what existed before. So by subtracting, you're actually adding. So that's roughly the kind of logic in which soft forks use in order to work. Now, and they've been used in Bitcoin. They're used in order to add in things like check lock time verify, a couple of new opcodes, pay to script hash, possibly going to be adding segregated witness soon. Then the other kind of fork is what I call a kind of hard fork. So basically a kind of hard fork is like a soft fork in reverse time. So valid messages under the new rules are a strict superset of valid messages under the old rules. So you're not shrinking, you're expanding. And then finally, you have a maximally hard fork, which is just arbitrary new rules. Chances are, there's going to be, most messages are going to be either valid under the old rules or valid under the new rules, probably not both. So the interesting thing is that these 3 different kinds of forks actually have very different mechanics, and they have very different governance properties. So soft forks basically depend on miners. If the majority of the miners agree on a soft fork, doesn't matter whether or not developers upgrade, doesn't matter whether or not users upgrade. Basically, fact is, the longest chain is only going to contain messages that are valid under the new rules. So what does this mean? It means that soft forks are a model that, first of all, heavily puts miners in charge. To some degree, it can't. Now, then there's the question of, what exactly are the failure modes of a soft fork? So basically, a soft fork could run successfully. Miners could adopt it, users could adopt it, and it could just run extremely smoothly. But what if it doesn't? So the one failure mode that it does have is, what if the users sign up but the miners don't sign up? So what if you have users downloading a client that reduces the set of blocks that they accept, but miners stick to the old rules, and guess what? There's a longest chain that most of the network considers invalid, but there's probably a few users that didn't sign up, and those few users are still in the old one, and so you have 2 communities that are kind of all following 2 different chains. So this is, If you want to avoid this, then the way soft forks have worked in practice is that they only turn on if a 75% threshold is satisfied. So only if 3/4 of miners vote for a particular soft fork does it actually take place. And this seems to be worked reasonably well most all of the times that it's been tried. Kind of hard fork relies on miners and developers and users. So if just the miners adopt it, then okay, the miners might start producing a chain which contains some expanded set of blocks or transactions, but the users aren't going to accept it. So users have to sign up. Now, here, interestingly enough, if the developers and the users sign up, but miners don't, then no change. So once again, it has this interesting safety property. So, for example, right now, if you run Bitcoin Classic, then you're safe if Bitcoin Classic gets adopted, you're safe if nothing changes, and you're safe if segregated witness gets adopted. So that's it. So this sort of kind of hard fork property actually becomes interesting because it provides this kind of safety that's different from the kind of safety you get from soft forks. And the reason why you get this sort of weird symmetry is because one is the other in reverse time. So one of them is shrinking, the other is expanding. Shrinking is expanding backwards. Miners sign up, but not developers and users. So this is the case where, once again, you have a chain split. And now, interestingly enough, you notice that the failure modes here are kind of opposite. So in this case, if the miners start creating a chain that's that has blocks that are invalid under the old rules, then developers and users have to switch over. So you need adequate warning time. You need some kind of room for people to upgrade. Now, then you have maximally hard forks. Now, these are interesting because they rely only on developers and users. So this is a common misconception that people have, that they think that miners are the ones that kind of have to agree. In reality, they don't matter a single bit. So, and basically the reason is you have an existing chain, then you have a hard fork. So we have the old rules, which we call rules A. Then we have the new rules, which we call rules B. You have miners on A and users on B, or users on A, miners on B, users on B. Those two universes kind of split up. They become actually separate universes. So miners on one chain and users on one chain, and they kind of see each other, but they see all the messages on the other side as being invalid. On the other side, you have miners on B, users on B. The users on B think all the blocks on side A are invalid. In this logic, you might notice that this still is true. It is true if chain A and chain B have 50% of the miners each. It's also true if chain A has 3% and chain B has 97% of the miners. So this is interesting because, first of all, it's an opposite governance model. And second of all, it's interesting because this is a model this is pretty much the only practical model for actually changing the consensus algorithm. So, if, let's say, for example, the Bitcoin community over time gains the viewpoints that the current level of mining centralization is unacceptable, we should switch to a different mining algorithm, or we should switch to proof of stake, chances are the current miners are not going to sign up for it. So how do you fix that? Well, you use a maximally hard fork that just says, well, we don't care if the users adopt it, then your messages just become invalid and you don't matter anymore. So route around them, pretty nice and simple. Failure modes. So hard fork, the failure mode is basically some users sign up, other users don't sign up. There's a chain split. And so the way you remedy that is you need some notion of social consensus. So you need people in general to agree beforehand whether or not the hard fork is going to happen. Because if people don't, then some of them go one way, some of them go the other way, and you have what could be a problem, or as I argue later, might potentially not be. So here is just an interesting reminder of the notion of Schelling points. So this was also created by, originally developed as a concept by good old Thomas Schelling, but the specific example I have here actually came from David Friedman. So suppose that we have two prisoners in a room, and these two prisoners in a room are shown this set of numbers: 162, 281, 296, 1000, 1209, 1612, 1728, 1837. And the prisoners are told, if both you and the other person give the same answer, so provide the same number, you're both going to be freed. Otherwise, you're going to be tortured to death. So question is, which of these numbers, if you were a prisoner, which of these numbers would you choose? So just to make this interesting, actually, I'm going to run this social experiment live. So how about everyone close your eyes, and I'm going to read these numbers and raise your hands if you agree, if that's the one you pick. Okay, go. 162, 281, 296, 1000, 1209, 1612, 1728, 1837. Okay, so interestingly enough, I had quite a few hands for 162, so unfortunately you guys are going to be dying a painful death. But you might notice that most people, well, at least I noticed that, and those of you who didn't follow the instructions noticed, that 1000 is the one everyone raised their hands on. So why does this happen? It's basically that, 1000, if you think of this just purely as a logical game, then all 8 options are just arbitrary labels, they look exactly the same. But the key difference is 1000, is sort of understood in human culture to be this sort of special salient number. And everyone knows this, and everyone knows that everyone else knows this, and everyone knows that everyone else knows that everyone else knows this. And so you think that, because of this, you expect that other people are going to be likely to pick the number 1000, and therefore, because of that, you're more likely to pick the number 1000. And the reason why you expect other people to pick the number 1000 is because you expect them to be thinking the exact same thing in their heads that you do. So it's a sort of weird infinite regression, and the equilibrium basically is that people pick the number that looks the most salient, which is 1000. Now I picked these numbers carefully because if you look at 1728 is 12 cubed. So if you're the sort of person who thinks in base 12, you might actually find 1728 to be the salient number, not 1000. So the point that I'm making here is that Schelling points are to some degree sort of culture dependent. And, well, they're completely culture dependent, but the question is how universal the culture is. And so they're very often imperfect. They rely on people actually accepting them. And if there is a kind of inference gap between, some people accepting a Schelling point and other people not accepting it, then you have a problem. So hard fork decision making. So let's say there is a proposed hard fork, and you have the choice that users have is whether or not to install a software package that accepts the fork. Now, if you're on the same chain as everyone else, that's good. If you're not on the same chain as everyone else, then you suffer an inconvenience. So it's roughly the same challenge issue or the same game as the Schelling point game. But of course, the difference is you suffer a fairly moderate inconvenience instead of being tortured to death. So what's the Schelling point? This is the question. You have choice A, you have choice B. How do we, is A more salient or is B more salient? So the pregame. Now, interestingly enough, in this sort of Schelling point type of game, like there is the moment of truth, the sum block number where people have to go one way or another. But there's also the pregame. So this is, what people do before that event. And basically, what can people do? They can engage in the wonderful human pastime of doing what game theorists call signaling. So it's basically, the way this game works is that each side, the incentive that each side has, so the people who support A and the people who support B, is sort of to puff itself up. So A's incentive is to kind of make its victory seem inevitable, because if they do that, then there's the incentive for people to just join A because they think, well, A is going to win, so I want to be with the winning side because that's more convenient for me, and B has the incentive to do the same thing. So to be very specific and run the risk of upsetting people who support Bitcoin Core and people who support Bitcoin Classic, I'll provide a very practical example. So if you look at, let's say, Bitcoin Classic, and if you've been following, the Reddit situation, then, and all the other channels, one of the things you notice is just how eager people on that subreddit are to, let's say, list particular mining pools as supporting Classic, or if they make any kind of message, suggesting that they have some support for it, then you might notice them basically saying, "Oh, look, these guys are on our side," and hey, look, 72% of the network supports us. Meanwhile, on the Bitcoin Core side, you have people organizing events that you call, quote, consensus roundtables, dragging all the miners there, pretending to invite people from the other side, but only giving them 48 hours notice to come, and then corralling miners and getting them to sign a statement saying we are only going to run software produced by the Bitcoin Core team. So basically, you see this behavior actually, you could actually see this behavior on both sides. It exists. Now, you might argue, well, is this really a result of game theory, or is this just human behavior that happens everywhere? I would argue to some degree it's not, because if you look at democratic politics, people often, both sides actually often want to make themselves be seen as the underdog for, basically cultural reasons. So, if you've been following U.S. politics, you might see Bernie Sanders complaining, or supporters pointing out how Hillary Clinton sort of is the establishment, and then Hillary trying to sort of deny that she's part of the establishment. Over here, these camps want to be seen as the establishment or the thing that's going to win. So, and the reason why is because voting is fundamentally different from a shelling game. Voting is just a matter of, people just making statements that by themselves don't really have economic incentives attached. The majority wins. Here, you have the incentive to go with the majority. And so the result is actually kind of different. Now, the next point is, if a shelling point exists, try to manipulate it. So the interesting thing about the Bitcoin scenario is that there actually is some kind of shelling point. And the shelling point is this idea that forks are so far only accepted if the majority of miners accept them. And so, of course, that's a very good and natural thing, because miners are highly visible. Miners, it's very obvious to see that, here are a bunch of blocks, and these blocks are supporting, this block is voting one way, this block is voting the other way. So it's a voting system that's not easily corruptible, as opposed to all the other voting systems where people can very easily create 10,000 accounts if they're on the internet. So that's nice. But then if that shelling point exists, then there is, of course, the incentive to try to manipulate it. If there's disagreement on what exactly is the definition of kind of the miners, then you want to try to make it look like, either there's like one way to measure it where it looks like 72%, one way to measure it where it looks like 5%. People who support A are going to try and emphasize the 72% case. People who support B are going to emphasize the 5% case. So in general, if the shelling point is imperfect, there's this incentive to try to manipulate it. So if no shelling point is agreed, then potentially, you could have a situation where basically the controversy continues all the way right up until the moment where the fork is supposed to actually happen. Now, there's another kind of political point here, which is that even if you accept the premise that that kind of hard fork scenario is dangerous, just because something is dangerous and harmful for everyone doesn't mean that it's always a bad move in a game theoretic sense. And the reason why it actually goes back to Thomas Schelling's theory of brinksmanship in nuclear warfare. So his theory is, he basically describes brinksmanship as kind of probabilistic punishment, or you could also describe it as kind of a probabilistic tit for tat in a prisoner's dilemma. And the situation here is, imagine you have the United States and the USSR. They're sort of in a Cold War against each other. Both the US and the USSR, they have the opportunity, they have the ability to make the move of just launching the rockets, at which case, a bunch of people, billions of people die, and that's the worst possible case for everyone. But they also have available to them more subtle moves. So one of those moves is they can, let's say, move set up nuclear sites in locations that are closer to the other party. Or they could create new kinds of defense systems. They could just in general act in ways that makes them seem more volatile. So in general, the idea is they can, actors within each of these entities can act in ways that create a political environment which is more likely to accidentally leads to total annihilation. And if one side does this, then the other side can potentially respond by doing the same thing. And so the idea is that instead of kind of meeting out small sort of fixed kind of attacks, as happens in iterated prisoner's dilemmas normally, you instead substitute that with attacks that essentially consist of a small probability of causing a huge amount of damage. So essentially the idea is that if you have disagreements, then there's lots of kind of political opportunity to maneuver in a bunch of directions. So now let's talk about the post game. So here we have, this interesting situation of, what happens if some fork happens? What if some people want to go with it, some people don't want to go with it? So here's one possible timeline. Let's say fork happens, 1 to 4 hours, basically the community realizes that a split is taking place, and particularly it's realizing that neither side is willing to back down. So I say, at this point, blockchain protocols have been as decentralized as they are. Much of people tends to like congregating on Reddit, and so people go on forums. They just realize that there are people on one subreddit who are gung ho about we're gonna push, we like A and we're gonna push A to the to our deaths. And you see people on the other side saying we're gung ho about B, we're gonna push B to our deaths. At some point in over 1 to 4 hours, people realize that basically neither side is going to back down. 1 to 2 days, next step. Some of the more quick and enterprising exchanges actually start trading BTC-A and BTC-B. So, there's a version of Bitcoin, which is, just Bitcoin on fork A. There's a version of, then you have Bitcoins on fork B. Bitcoins on fork A and Bitcoins on fork B become distinct currencies, and those currencies each end up being traded and having an independent exchange value. 1 to 7 days, businesses, Coinbase, BitPay, and so remittance companies make a decision to support one or neither or both. 1 to 2 weeks, 2 options. One of them is that either A or B is just clearly ahead, and the community of the other one is faltering. At which point, there might be a few diehards, but generally the community accepts that kind of either A wins or B wins. Option 2. That doesn't happen, and it turns out that both of them are either roughly even with each other or close enough to even that they're both accepted as viable. Then, as a safety measure, once developers realize that, okay, this is what happens, neither of us is going to win, then they make the first kind of blockchain peace treaty or cross-blockchain peace treaty that you could call, and they take the simple expedient of just either both chains soft forking or one chain hard forks, just to create the security property that transactions on one chain are not accidentally valid on the other chain, and transactions on B are not accidentally valid on A. So it's just a simple thing that both chains can do just to improve the security of both of them so that people don't accidentally screw up. And the reason why I call this kind of a peace treaty is that it's just a mutually beneficial thing, that for both camps to do. And at some point, once they realize that, that they're both here to stay, they're just going to do it between each other. Now then, there's the question, is the total market cap higher or lower than the original? And hard to tell. So network effects and anti-network effects. So basically, the answer of, is the total going to be higher, is the total going to be lower, depends on these parameters. So people talk a lot about blockchain network effects. They talk a lot about this idea that, blockchain networks become more useful and more powerful the more people use them. A couple reasons why that's true. One of them is if the currency gets more accepted, it has more liquidity, it has a lower spread, you're able to transact larger amounts of money before you seriously widen the spread. Developer mindshare. Now, interesting points about developer mindshare is that developer mindshare is actually could be cross-protocol. So if you have 2 sibling protocols that are very similar to each other, then potentially, depending on why they fork or what changes they implement afterwards, the software that's designed for one could easily be ported to the other. So this effect may be small, or it could be bigger. Economic security, another positive. So the bigger a protocol is, the more hash power it has, the more expensive it is to attack. Or if it's proof of stake, then size of deposits. But you also have anti-network effects. So number one is blockchain congestion. So as a blockchain gets bigger, the fees go up, the cost of running a full node goes up. And this actually played itself out, I think, so there was this post on the mining forums a few weeks ago where some miner basically told people to cash out using altcoins because the fees for Bitcoin transactions were too high at that particular time. Well, it was a combination of fees and confirmation times. So the effect is real. There are anti-network effects as well as network effects. Then there's political infighting. And finally, the other negative is that bigger applications invite bigger attackers. So if you just think about, the third item, economic security, you might wonder, well, okay, why is it that, all of these tiny coins are surviving? Why aren't they just all being taxed to death if they have like only $100,000 of economic security? And the answer is, they have low security, but they also have a low incentive to attack them. And so basically they just, in practice, they end up being relatively fine. So in economics, there's this general notion of firm theory. So this is the question. So firm theory tries to ask two questions. One of them is, well, okay, we have markets, and we know that markets and trade are welfare improving, and under certain circumstances are efficient. And so the question is, why do we even have companies? Why can't everyone just be an independent contractor? And there's a few arguments. So one of them is underproduced public goods. And in general, when people hear the word public goods, they think about this as in the context of, either global or national public goods and things that sort of have to be produced by governments. But in reality, the concept is like much broader. And even if you look at, something like even like maintenance of some particular office, like it's a partial public good to some extent. And that's something that could be provided by a corporation, but it's harder to kind of get all the people who live in the office to agree to pay for it if they're all independent contractors. Lack of coordination, it's hard to even make those kinds of agreements. Transaction costs, bureaucratic cost of agreeing on pricing between everyone, cognitive overhead, cost of gaining trust. The next question you have is, well, okay, so there's those problems, but so then if those problems exist, why doesn't everyone just work for one single giant corporation? And my sort of three-word answer is see North Korea. So basically there's a balance between this kind of one kind of failure and the other kind of failure. And I would argue that sort of that kind of firm theory argument actually exists in the blockchain space as well. So left side failures, everyone has their own currency, low liquidity for each one, high cognitive overhead, developer confusion, one currency to rule them all, failure to satisfy different views, potentially loss of cohesion, potentially fighting rather than coexistence. So essentially, the reason, like, in the Republican Party and Democratic Party, very often fight and attack each other. Meanwhile, if you look at, like Apple and Android, sometimes they fight each other, but most of the time people just pick one, and the communities that prefer one are happy with one, the communities that prefer the other are happy with the other. So that kind of model generally makes people happier, but of course the problem is that it's often hard to figure out how it can apply to certain circumstances, especially when public goods and are an issue. So I would argue that there's a balance here as well, and sometimes exit is better than voice. So blockchains versus other kinds of governance. So we talked a lot about kind of the specific kind of challenges around sort of existing blockchain governance mechanisms, kind of what the political game looks like. Now, let's compare it to situations that exist now. So open source projects. So quite often open source projects are fairly centrally controlled. You have someone like Linus Torvalds who's sort of a, quote, benevolent dictator for life. Sometimes it's a company. What happens if some developers are unhappy with the way that the current benevolent dictators are doing their jobs? Answer is you can just fork. So take the code, fork it off, and sometimes these forks are even quite friendly with the original. So they often, these forks just keep on merging most of the changes from the original, except for the changes that they don't like. And so you might even see forks that kind of stay pretty close to the original and remain in parallel for a long time. Or forks can diverge to a very large extent. Now, countries and corporations, forking is not possible at all because, unfortunately, you can't take an apple, fork it, and get two apples that are equally as good as the original. You can't take, now, the only thing that is possible is generally exit. Now, there is also the option of secession, but secession only really works well when disagreements are relatively localized. So if people in one province think one way and the people in the rest of the country think another way, then yeah, chances are secession is probably optimal. But oftentimes that's not how disagreements are distributed. Now here's a puzzle. Why don't we see corporate secession? So if there's disagreements within a company, then why doesn't some particular component of the company essentially negotiate kind of splitting off and becoming a separate entity? And you know, chances are it happens sometimes, but it's sort of done under another name. Maybe it's the case that exit is too easy. Most employees don't really have shares, so they might as well just quit and go work for someone else. So the two are kind of different, but they're also kind of similar. Now, between open source projects and these kind of real world entities, blockchains are somewhere in the middle because forking is possible, but forking often has a cost. In that, basically, if you fork off, then you know there are risks involved. You can't really. It's hard to tell whether or not the project, your sort of new fork, is even going to survive. There are these sort of network effect challenges. There's infrastructure, but at the same time, forking is, as in actually splitting a protocol in half, actually is possible. So it's weird. Next step, so DAOs. So we talked a lot about blockchains. Blockchains are kind of independent things. DAOs are different because DAOs are dependent. What I mean by that is, if you look at a blockchain, you know, if you look at something like Bitcoin, Ethereum, it's an independent thing. It relies on nothing to except for itself. Like it relies on, you know, TCP/IP and it relies on all that other stuff, but generally people are happy to assume that those things kind of just work. So meanwhile, if you look at, you know, DAOs, if you look at something like MakerDAO, you know, this LockDAO, like one of these voting DAOs, they exist on Ethereum. And so the difference is that if a standalone decentralized organism, if the community agrees to sort of change the rules in some way, the community can just do that. And there exists this sort of notion of community consensus where each user is kind of has the freedom to choose which direction they go. If your mechanism is a DAO on Ethereum, then at least by default you don't have that option because Ethereum itself kind of defines what the rules are. You know, the rules are stuck in the contract, and there is some formal notion of state. And you know, there ultimately is sort of one single source of truth because that's what Ethereum as a blockchain provides. So basically the difference is, now, once again, controversy time, you know, on an independent blockchain protocol, ultimately truth is subjective. So there's, you know, there are people like, you know, Chris DeRose who say that, well, no, proof of work is all about, you know, the fact that truth is objective and it's all about who's got the most work and the longest chain. I personally think that viewpoint is crazy. And even the Bitcoin client thinks that viewpoint is crazy because if you give the Bitcoin client a chain that's much, much longer than the original and has much more work than the original, then even if that chain, you know, even if that's the case, if that chain has a block in it which is invalid according to your personal view, the software that you personally run, then you're not going to accept it. So ultimately, it's not just about the longest chain; it's about the longest valid chain, and every user is free to decide for themselves what's valid. So even on blockchains, truth is subjective, and I think that's perfectly fine. But on dependent projects, truth isn't subjective to the same extent because you have if you assume that the underlying blockchain layer itself isn't going to fork, then it does provide a ground truth. It is something that everyone agrees upon. It is objective in some sense. So DAO governance is actually more like governance of corporations, I would argue. Now, let's talk about governance of decentralized autonomous corporations. How do DAOs decide? Simplest protocol that everyone thinks of first is just voting. So if you have shares of a DAO, those shares can vote, and you know the majority decides. So the problem with voting is basically that voting is not incentive compatible. And there's a few ways in which that shows. So Brian Kaplan talks a lot about rational irrationality. Some other economists talk about rational ignorance. So this is generally the idea that because in a voting system, each individual's share of the total is often very small, each individual's incentive to even learn about which approach is correct is often very close to zero. And so the only motive that people have to learn anything at all is basically personal curiosity. And so now it's actually less of a problem for DAOs and corporations and countries, basically because they are a bit more centralized. So you often have individual actors that have 1% of the entire stake, 5% of the entire stake, 0.5% of the entire stake. Doesn't really happen in voting where it's kind of maximally egalitarian. And so one of the benefits that you get out of this sort of somewhat higher level of centralization is that you actually do have at least some actors that have a somewhat higher incentive to kind of learn about what the issues are, and chances are at those levels it might not even be a problem. Now that's only one part of the problem. Then you also have 51% attacks. So 51% attacks are pretty simple. So actually, we'll talk about, voter bribery is the other one I'll mention. So basically, you just pay $5 to everyone who votes for A, and, individuals that have a very low incentive, each individual's, the probability that each individual will decide the outcome is very low, and so each individual has a very low incentive to vote in the way that they think is correct. And so a bribe that's very small might actually just sway them all in one direction. So 51% attacks. Basically, 51% of shareholders in a particular DAO decide that they're going to move all of the DAO's assets into a new DAO, and basically they're expropriating the other 49%. Now, here we have a bit of an interesting argument in that if the DAO's assets are in some sense primarily social capital and goodwill, then there's a bit of a grim trigger argument, which is basically that, well, if this attack happens one time and if this attack succeeds, then all of a sudden there's this kind of new sort of social expectation that this sort of thing happens often, and so people become worried, would this attack happen again? Am I going to be the one that's going to be expropriated next? And so because people realize that if the split happens, that's what's going to happen, then more splits might happen, then even the initial 51% might be incentivized not to go through with an attempted expropriation. So otherwise, though, sometimes this might not be the case because the 51% could, in just one step, expropriate, have a smart contract automatically distribute the funds among themselves, and at that point disappear. So in corporate governance land, stuff like this is basically why we need shareholder regulations. So in DAO land, basically, something equivalent to that functionality has to be provided. Now, there was this idea that I came up with last year that I called subjectivocracy, and the idea basically is that if a DAO only holds assets that are defined by itself, so those might be like its own shares, maybe some kind of registry inside the DAO, then in the event that there's a serious disagreement, the DAO might actually fork on the chain. So literally on top of the blockchain, there would be a function in the contract by which basically the contract would kind of copy itself, all the state would copy itself, and you would have the users that the users that voted for A would be inside of one copy, the users that voted for B would be in the other copy, and the two of them will kind of continue on as independent entities. So if you are a user who is kind of indifferent, and let's say you're just some automaton inside of an IoT device, you don't really have opinions, you don't know which one to follow, then you could actually just check the market price of the token of DAO A and the token of DAO B, let's say against some base currency like Ether, and so figure out kind of which one is more popular and just stick to that one. So the idea here is basically you actually can build a thing on top of Ethereum that has the same governance properties as an independent blockchain if that's what you want. So DAO splitting. So the Slock team came up with this ingenious strategy about a month ago. And the idea here is that you basically extend the notion of subjectivocracy to a DAO that actually holds assets that are externally defined. So the idea is, these would be assets that particular DAO does not have any control over itself, and it could be Ether, it could be Digix Gold, it could be assets defined by other DAOs. The protocol that the SWOG team came up with is this notion of DAO splitting. So if, let's say, 60% wants to go one way, and the other 40% feels that it's an expropriation attempt, then what they can do is they can order a split, and what happens is that the assets the DAO kind of forks in half, 60% go here, 40% go here, and the assets get split proportionally. So 60% of the assets go here, 40% of the assets go there. And this essentially makes that kind of expropriation attack not really possible. Now, the interesting thing is you actually don't need to specify a minimum percentage. So you don't need to say, you need at least 10% in order to fork. Because, if you did, that would be a security vulnerability, because if someone wanted to expropriate you, instead of you, filling up 51%, they just fill up 91%. So you don't need to specify a minimum percentage. The only thing you need to do is to prevent spam. You need to make sure that it's the minority that pays the cost of splitting. So you need to make sure that it's the minority that pays the cost of actually, creating this new copy of the DAO on the chain. Fairly simple thing. Once you have it, then DAO splitting kind of works. Here is something that Solok's DAO splitting protocol has actually not solved. non-fungible assets. So we know about tokens. We know how to split up currencies. You know, if there's 100 units of Digix gold, 60 go here, 40 go here. What if, in general, Ethereum is about kind of being maximally abstract and maximally general? So what if we're not talking about coins, we're talking about relationships? So there is this DAO. This DAO has relationships with a number of other addresses, and each of these addresses, you know, one of them might be a coin, one of them might be some kind of position in a financial contract, one of them might be a registry entry. One option is probabilistic distribution. So for every single address that that contract has a relationship with, there's a 60% chance, if you know it's a 60-40 split, there's a 60% chance that the contract's entire relationship with that address goes here, and a 40% chance it goes here. One approach, but it has two problems. One of them is it imposes risk, so you don't get a neat 60-40 split. It could end up being 100-0, could end up being 20-80, could end up being 50-50. And it requires secure random number generation, which is often hard to do on a blockchain. Option two, cut and choose protocols. So cut and choose protocols were originally invented to solve this sort of math problem of how to fairly cut a cake. And so the protocol that was eventually developed is basically one person does the cut and the other person chooses. And the theory is that the person who does the cut is incentivized to cut fairly, because if the person does an unbalanced cut that's like 70-30, then basically the second guy is going to take the 70, and so the first guy's left with the 30. So the first guy's incentive is to make the cut in such a way that it's exactly 50-50 or as close as possible. So problem is distribution might not be perfectly fair, because if you have these relationships, and if, let's say, none of them add up to quite an even 50%, and let's say the closest you can get to 50% is like 59-41, then guess what? One side, or let's say if it's a 60-40 split, you can't really quite do 60%, then the closest you can do is like 69-31. Then it's not going to be perfectly fair. One side's going to do better than the other. Now, a third option, I think, that's a bit underexplored, is cut and choose plus compensation payments. So if the closest you can do is either, let's say, 69-31 or like 52-48, then what the two parties negotiate between each other and they agree, we're going to do 69-31, but the side that gets 69 has to pay 100 Ether to the DAO that gets 31. So this sort of brings back the kind of perfect fungibility, like infinite granularity that you get from having a currency. But the problem is that it's a bilateral monopoly problem, and in general, from game theory, we know that negotiation between bilateral monopolies is not Pareto efficient. So chances there's some risk that both parties are not going to agree on a split that satisfies them. And depending on the way the rules of the game work, it's going to kind of cause an actual efficiency loss. So there's going to be some amount of economic value that doesn't even go to either party, it just gets lost. So an Ethereum-specific challenge is, if we want this kind of maximum generality, if we want to actually split up the DAO's relationships, and you can think of it almost as kind of a sort of crypto divorce, then how do you actually do this on Ethereum, right? So one approach is to just split it by address. So the idea is that you say, in general, for every address, we decide if the mother contract's relationship with that address belongs to A or whether it belongs to B, and if you want to kind of do it in this sort of nice kind of just-in-time, lazy evaluated way, then essentially what you do is the mother contract kind of does sort of two-way forwarding for children. So you have child A, you have child B. Child B can continue on any of its relationships by sending a message to the mother, and the mother automatically sort of does a forward if that address is actually an address that child B is entitled to interact with. Otherwise, if it's an address child A is entitled to interact with, then only child A is the one that can sort of forward messages along through and kind of act on behalf of the mother. So that's an option. But then here's another interesting challenge. In some cases, the relationship can't be split. In some cases, the fact is it's a coin or it's something like a coin, and it can be proportionately split. So how do you detect that? So there's interesting challenges there. Next topic, futarchy. So Martin already talked about this a bit, so this fortunately gives me a license to slightly rush through this section. I'm going to assume people 100% understood everything about futarchy. So the general principle is you pick some easily objectable, measurable objective function, and you have sort of conditional prediction markets on the objective function if the action is made and if the action is not made. So in a DAO that has shares, one of the common objectives is just the share price. So essentially, you have this sort of conditional prediction market, and you're trying to predict what's going to happen what would the share price be if the action is made. On the other market, you try to predict what would the share price be if the action is not made. And the idea is you perform the action only if the conditional share price if the action is made is greater than the conditional share price if the action is not made. So if the market thinks A is better for the share price than B, then you do A, otherwise you do B. So there's actually a pretty simple way to implement this. And the approach is you just let everyone who has one DAO share, convert it into one yes share and one no share. Then everyone who has Ether, convert it into a bundle of one yes Ether and one no Ether. And then you just let yes Ether trade against yes shares, let no Ether trade against no shares, and you just watch the prices. And the reason why yes shares, no shares, yes Ether and no Ether have value is that at the end of the day, if the yes decision is made, then yes Ether get converted into Ether and yes shares get converted into shares, and no Ether and no shares disappear. Otherwise, it's the no Ether and the no shares that actually get turned into Ether and shares. So pretty simple way to implement it, actually. So the main challenge behind Futarchy is basically, is it vulnerable to manipulation? And this is one of the thing that the experiments that Martin Koppelman is going to be running are intended to empirically measure. So the challenge is, what if there's some action that only slightly affects the share price? So people think that the share price is right now is around $10, but it might only go up. But people have a vague idea that they might have accurate information that this decision is slightly good. So the share price would be 4 cents higher if the decision is made than if it was not made. But the problem is that, let's say there's some group of people that really want yes to happen, then they might want to try to manipulate the yes market upwards. So they might want to try to buy up as many yes shares as they can. And of course, the problem is that people might have accurate, what's going to happen, let's say no is actually slightly better. People are going to see, okay, yes is priced higher than no, but no should be priced higher than yes. And so I should be able to, sell some yes and buy some no, and I should be able to kind of bet against that. But the problem is that even if you have accurate information that no is slightly better, you can't easily trade on that knowledge without actually buying the buying the no shares and shorting the yes shares. And by doing that, you're assuming a whole bunch of secondary risks. So if for some unrelated reason the DAO shares go up to $15, they go down or they go down to $5, that's the risk that you're accepting. And so the set of people who's willing to make those kind of counter manipulation trades is often limited. So there's also this kind of limits to arbitrage argument that some people make, which is that because actors have capital limitations, then shorting is actually, or counter trading against upward manipulation is harder than the other way around, basically because if you're shorting, you have to put some collateral up, but what if your collateral gets completely consumed because the price goes up even higher? And so, shorting is kind of not really risk-free. So there's two solutions to these general problems. One of them is to kind of only use Futarchy for big decisions. So things that affect the share price by like $10, 200% each way instead of 1% each way. Another interesting solution is to bet on the logarithm of the price instead of the price. And the reason why this is nice is because the logarithm of the price is practically capped at some number like 30. And so you can short, and so the amount of capital that you need to short absolutely safely is limited. So there is another approach, but the first solution is actually the one I'm going to focus on. So interestingly enough, there's actually a really nice way to use Futarchy only as a kind of special purpose backstop against voting going wrong. So here's the idea. Let's say there's a voting decision, and let's say the minority is unhappy with the voting decision. What they can do is they can kind of file a complaint with a DAO. Futarchy, a Futarchy is set up so people can convert shares into yes shares and no shares. People can convert Ether into yes Ether and no Ether. And Futarchy resolves whether or not the motion goes through. Here's the interesting thing. If, let's say, the yes people are expropriators and they're trying to expropriate everyone, 60% trying to expropriate the 40%, then them trying to manipulate the market to push up the price of yes shares actually is not a problem. And here, the reason why is because if they try to manipulate the price of the yes shares upward, what they're actually doing is they're basically setting a price floor on the yes shares, and it actually lets the no proponents sort of cash out gracefully, because it lets the no proponents convert their shares into no shares and yes shares and just sell the yes shares to the manipulators. And so basically, you know, if they do that, then they get paid. So they don't get expropriated, they actually get their money out. So it's, even if the manipulation attempt succeeds, it's actually in some ways a peaceful resolution. So here's an interesting idea. So governing blockchains like DAOs. So DAOs seem to have these kind of interesting governance options available to them that blockchains don't. And what if you decide, okay, I don't really like this sort of soft fork, hard fork stuff and all this sort of political mutually assured destruction stuff. I want to have something that looks like a DAO. And let's say it wants to have a base protocol run by voting with a futarchy backstop. You have a few challenges. One of them is that you don't have a base asset to make markets against. So DAOs on Ethereum have Ether, you know, or they can use Digix Gold, they can use whatever they want. If you want to use it for Ethereum itself, what does Ether have? You could say Digix Gold, but the problem is, well, then you're creating a dependency on Digix being honest for the entire protocol. That's not a security assumption you want to make. So in proof-of-work blockchains, you could use difficulty futures. Now, the reason you want to use difficulty futures is because difficulty actually takes a while to go up. And so, you know, because miners take a long time to sign on, and so difficulty futures are this kind of easier mechanism for doing it, because they could actually go up pretty quickly. That's only for proof-of-work blockchains. For proof-of-stake blockchains, like, you could use shelling dollars, so sort of some kind of like decentralized stable currency, but then that introduces a dependency on much stronger economic assumptions into the base protocol once again. So there's risks both ways. You could do voting, and voting is something that DAOs do, but guess what? Miner voting is used already. So yay, it's something that's already been incorporated. Blockchain splitting can also be done. It's called a hard fork. Yay, it's also something we're doing already. So futarchy is, interestingly enough, the one that's kind of not being done yet. And a bit earlier, a couple of months ago in the Bitcoin block size debate, Paul Sturtz actually did make a bunch of Reddit posts basically saying, hey, why don't we use prediction markets to solve this problem? Why don't we use prediction markets to figure out whether going with core or whether going with classic is going to result in a higher Bitcoin price? Ended up and it ended up sort of not really happening and not being adopted. And of course, you could, I mean, there's a bunch of sort of reasons you might argue as to why. The most innocent ones is just the software is just not plain ready yet. Another innocent one is that, you know, using prediction markets in that way for blockchain protocols is highly untested, and you don't want a $6 billion cryptocurrency to be the first test. The more sort of cynical interpretation would be that both sides were actually much less cynical than they were publicly claiming. They were publicly expressing or they were much less confident they were publicly expressing that they were, and so they all secretly thought that the camp that they were backing was actually the camp that's likely to be harmful to the price. But that's, in this particular case, a bit harder to believe, because, you know, to some degree, neither of the two sides really kind of picked up on it more than the other side did. So chances are, you know, people at this point just think that this is something that's worth doing smaller experiments for first before going to a bigger one. Another argument not to do it for base layer systems is just that it probably introduces a dependency on either shelling US dollar or some kind of centralization risk. So there's good reasons to kind of be concerned about it for the time being. So those are that's roughly a kind of menu of options that, you know, both sort of blockchain protocols and DAOs sitting on top of blockchains have. So in general, you know, people are starting to realize that, you know, you want to have protocols that are able to evolve and that are able to kind of iterate, improve even on the base layer over time. But the challenge is there are kind of all these different ways of doing it. There are all these different ways of agreeing on whether or not to do it. And there's the real question of, you know, which one is better. And ultimately, I think if you want to figure out which of these mechanisms are better, you have to try them all. Ultimately, if you want to figure out exactly how these different political mechanisms work, one of the challenges of going from economics to a sort of crypto political science is that it's not just about incentives. It's also about the very specific parameters of how the community behind each particular blockchain works. About sort of what the social contract is, so what the sort of agreed terms are about what parts of the protocol are supposed to be easy to change, what parts of the protocol are supposed to be hard to change. And so, in Bitcoin, there's this, a lot of people, for example, have this idea that soft forks are better, but that's not the only viewpoint that people have. So, for example, it's very possible to do something that's something like demirage, so something equivalent to, basically pushing the supply above 21 million, because demirage and inflation are basically the same thing. They're just kind of denominated differently. It's possible to do that with a soft fork, but a lot of people are very rightfully obviously very against that. And the reason is they also have other values, and one of those values is not pushing the supply above 21 million. It's kind of one of those things that's kind of in the social contract that defines what Bitcoin is as a cryptocurrency. Then there's stuff like, well, it's a currency and it should continue working as a currency. There's this this idea that kind of unilaterally expropriating people is bad. So there's also these sort of different social contracts. Then there's the challenge of do different protocols have different social contracts to them? Can you even potentially what if you have a situation where you have a hard fork where could it even be that the reason why the hard fork is happening isn't even about the technical content of the hard fork itself, but it's more about hard forking the social contract. So potentially that, I would even argue that's a kind of underappreciated angle of the sort of Bitcoin disputes particularly. So to some degree, you could even argue that a hard fork is a hard fork of the social contract toward a contract that's more friendly to hard forking, if interestingly enough. So there's, then we've had blockchains for years. The other thing we're starting to run up against are DAOs. So the nice thing about DAOs now is that when all of us, myself, Joel, and others were originally thinking about the concept, it was kind of fairly utopian. We were thinking, ooh, this is a really wonderful idea. We're going to have these sort of decentralized things running these sort of automated crypto institutions. Now, Ethereum exists. DAOs are starting to exist, and so instead of just sort of being sort of hand wavy up in the air about it, we can actually look at what people are actually starting to do with in real life, and we can start the fun part, which is looking at security vulnerabilities. So thank you.